started like any other quiet evening in my small, unassuming neighborhood. The kind of place where lawns were always trimmed, curtains were always drawn, and neighbors exchanged polite but hollow greetings. My first real encounter with the man next door was after I had lived here for 6 months. He was an older gentleman, thin to the point of frailty, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. His name was Mr. Crowley, though no one really used it. Everyone just referred to him as the neighbor. He rarely left his house except at dusk when he would shuffle outside to collect his mail, often dressed in the same faded robe that seemed to barely hang onto his bony frame. Rumors about him swirled in whispers at block parties and among passing conversations. He had lost his wife in some grisly accident. He had no family and no visitors. He had once been a doctor or maybe a mortician, before something happened that left him reclusive and, frankly, unnerving. But I'd never given much thought to any of this. Not until I saw him dragging what looked like a garbage bag that leaked something dark and wet across his backyard one night. I tried not to stare, but the sound of something heavy scraping against the grass seemed to echo in the stillness, accompanied by a low humming that could only have been his voice. That was the first night I realized I could see his backyard from my second-floor window. From then on, I found myself glancing out, almost habitually, just to catch a glimpse of whatever odd behavior he might display. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was about a month later when the scratching noises began. At first, they were faint, just a soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the wall I shared with his house. I assumed it was mice or some other pest and tried to ignore it, but the noises grew louder, more deliberate, and always at odd hours of the night. I knocked on the wall once, hoping to spook whatever was causing it, but to my shock, the scratching stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt suffocating. Minutes later, a faint tap came from my window. I froze, the blood draining from my face as I turned my head toward the glass. There was nothing there, just the faint outline of my reflection against the darkness outside. But the tap came again, sharp and deliberate, as though someone or something wanted my attention. When I finally mustered the courage to pull back the curtain, I saw nothing but the dark silhouette of Mr. Crowley's house, his windows like empty, watchful eyes. The next day, I decided to confront him. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding against my ribs. The door creaked open just enough to reveal his gaunt face, his sunken eyes fixing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Yes?" he asked, his voice dry and raspy, like dead leaves crumbling underfoot. I stammered out something about the noise, about the strange tapping, but he simply smiled, a thin, unnatural stretch of his lips that exposed yellowed teeth, and said, "You must be imagining things." Before I could respond, he shut the door in my face. That night, the noises escalated. It was no longer just scratching. It was pounding, as though something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of his house, of shadows moving behind his curtained windows, of figures with elongated limbs and faces that twisted in impossible shapes. The following week, I noticed a strange smell coming from his property, a sickly sweet, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. I convinced myself it was just a dead animal, but when I saw him in his backyard again, dragging another black garbage bag, the smell grew stronger, and I realized it was coming from whatever was inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, reporting the smell and the strange noises, but when they came to investigate, they found nothing. "He's just an old man," one officer told me. "You're probably overthinking it." But as they left, I saw Mr. Crowley watching me from his window, his thin fingers parting the curtain just enough to reveal one glaring eye. That night, I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. My heart raced as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the noise. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, but there was no sign of anyone inside. I locked it and checked every room, every closet, every shadow, but I found nothing. The final straw came 2 nights later. I was staring out my window again, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, when I saw him standing in his backyard, staring directly at me. his head tilted unnaturally to one side, his mouth moving as though he was speaking, but I couldn't hear a sound. Then he raised his hand and pointed at me. At that moment, every light in my house went out. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, the screen casting an eerie glow in the pitch-black room. Just as I turned on the flashlight, I heard it, a faint, wheezing breath coming from behind me. I spun around, the light shaking in my trembling hand, but there was no one there. Yet the breathing continued, louder, closer, until it was right next to my ear. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. The door was locked, the house silent, but something was different. My second-floor window, the one facing Mr. Crowley's house, was wide open. I haven't seen him since that night, but every so often, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping past the window, a reflection that doesn't match my own. And the scratching, it hasn't stopped. It started on the first night I moved into the house across the street from the abandoned one. My new neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, too peaceful in fact, and when I saw the house next door, I had a strange feeling. It was a large, decrepit mansion, with windows covered by thick, tattered curtains. The grass had overgrown, and the porch was warped, sagging as though it had been forgotten. I assumed it was simply unoccupied, like many other houses in the area, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The neighbors, if you could call them that, were distant, strange people who never seemed to want to socialize. They kept to themselves, and I never saw them outside except when they had their eyes locked on me, always from a distance, always watching. It was unsettling. But there was one figure I noticed more than others, the one who lived in that forsaken house. He was tall, gaunt, with skin so pale it seemed to shimmer under the dim streetlights at night. His name was Mr. Grayson, I eventually learned, a man who rarely came out during the day and whose presence felt like a dark shadow hanging over everything. The few times I saw him, I'd catch a glimpse of him standing at his window, staring out, his face expressionless, just observing. It was easy to ignore, but over time, the staring grew more intense. It wasn't just him looking out. It was as though he was looking for something. For me, every time I walked to my car or stood on my porch, I'd feel his gaze, heavy, cold, penetrating. I couldn't escape it. The first incident that made me realize something was wrong happened one night when I was home alone. The storm had been raging for hours, wind howling and rain pounding on the roof. But what bothered me the most was the eerie silence that followed. The power had gone out, and my flashlight was the only source of light in the room. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window, almost like fingernails scraping against glass. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move as I slowly turned my head toward the window. And there he was, Mr. Grayson, standing just outside, his face pressed against the glass, staring right at me. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his lips curled into a twisted grin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The wind howled louder, drowning out any sound I could make, and for what felt like an eternity, he stood there, motionless, never blinking, never moving a muscle. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and I bolted to the door, but when I looked out the window, he was gone. My heart raced as I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just a trick of the storm or my mind playing games with me. But then, the tapping returned, louder this time, as if he was trying to get in. I ran through the house, locking every door and window, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I even called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no traces of anyone having been there. They assured me it was probably just an animal or a branch tapping on the window, but deep down, I knew it was him, Mr. Grayson. From that night on, the odd occurrences only escalated. I began hearing strange noises at night, scraping sounds, thumping noises like someone walking through the walls. One evening, I decided to investigate, to see if there was any truth to the rumors about the house next door. I went over when the sun had just dipped below the horizon, my heart hammering in my chest as I approached the front door. The house was dark, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, suffocating me. I knocked twice, but there was no answer, so I turned the handle. To my surprise, it opened. The door creaked as I stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The wooden floors groaned under my weight, but I pushed forward. The house was as eerie as I had imagined, cold, damp, and lifeless. But as I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned around constantly, convinced I was being watched. Then I found it, the basement door. It was ajar, and the darkness that poured out from the crack seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I had to know what was down there. I descended into the basement, each step creaking loudly in the otherwise silent house. The air grew colder the further I went, and when I reached the bottom, I was met with a chilling sight. The walls were covered in old, yellowed newspaper clippings, all about people who had gone missing over the years, each one connected to the house next door in some way. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the articles, but then I heard it again, the sound of scraping, the sound of someone moving in the dark behind me. I turned, but no one was there. Panic surged through me as I rushed back up the stairs, but when I reached the top, the door was no longer open. It had been slammed shut, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the house swallowed my cries. It wasn't until the next morning that I managed to escape, but things had changed. The house next door was no longer abandoned. Mr. Grayson had moved in, but there was something different about him. His eyes were darker, more hollow, and when he saw me, he smiled that same twisted grin. "I told you I'd find you," he whispered. "You're mine now." I ran as fast as I could, but I knew I wasn't going to be free. He had watched me for so long, waiting, and now he had me. There was no escaping him, no escaping the hollow house. I never thought much about the old house next door until I moved into the quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of place where the lawns were neatly mowed, the birds chirped in the morning, and you could hear the faint sound of kids playing in the distance, the perfect illusion of peace. But the house next door was different, like it didn't quite belong. It sat abandoned for years before anyone moved in. The new neighbor was a man named Mr. Finch, a quiet man with a pale complexion and a stiff gait. He never spoke to anyone, not even when we happened to cross paths on the street. At first, I didn't mind the isolation. I assumed he was just another reclusive person who enjoyed solitude, but something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, bothered me. I first noticed it on one of those rare nights when I found myself awake at 3 in the morning. The house was silent. The entire block seemed asleep, but I saw him standing in his front yard, staring directly at my window. He didn't move, just stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees that lined his property. I tried to shake it off as my imagination running wild, but when I glanced again, he was still there, standing perfectly still, his eyes locked onto me. I pulled the blinds down and locked the window, but sleep never came that night. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though someone was always lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. It wasn't just in the dead of night, either. During the day, as I went about my usual routine, I would often feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and sure enough, when I looked out the window, there he was, standing at the edge of his property, staring at me. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. He was just an old man, probably eccentric, but something in his stillness unnerved me. The way he never blinked, never moved except to shift his weight slightly, made my skin crawl. One evening, I decided to confront him, to ask if there was something wrong. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe he had a mental condition, maybe he wasn't all there in the head. I gathered my courage and walked over to his house, knocking on the door, half expecting him to ignore me or even shout at me to go away. But when the door opened, Mr. Finch's eyes were as hollow as ever, and he greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice that was soft, almost too soft. "I've noticed you out there a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "and I was wondering if everything was okay. You've been standing in your yard for hours sometimes." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. His gaze seemed to drift past me, and I could feel the temperature drop as a chill swept over me. Finally, he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "I watch," he said simply, as though it explained everything. I didn't know what to say, so I muttered something about leaving him alone, but he stepped closer to me, blocking the doorframe, and the smell hit me. A foul, decaying odor that almost made me gag. "Don't go in your basement," he said in a whisper so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I froze, confused, my mind racing. "What?" I managed to ask. "Don't go in your basement," he repeated, his voice a little more forceful this time. I backed away, unnerved, but before I could turn to leave, he added, "You'll see me again." I didn't think much about what he said, but as I walked back home, my thoughts were clouded with unease. When I got inside, I decided to ignore the odd encounter and just go to bed. But that night, the scratching started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a mouse scurrying in the walls, but it grew louder, sharper, as though someone was scraping their nails against the plaster. It came from the basement. The sound was so persistent that I couldn't ignore it, even though I had no intention of going down there. But then I remembered Mr. Finch's warning. I was too terrified to investigate, but I had to know what was causing the noise. So, reluctantly, I grabbed a flashlight and crept down to the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I touched the handle, the scratching stopped. I hesitated, my hand trembling, but I pushed the door open anyway. The basement was dimly lit by the faint glow of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was nothing there, nothing unusual, but the air felt thick, oppressive, like something was waiting. That's when I saw it. The small, dusty window near the ceiling, the one that faced Mr. Finch's house. Someone had been standing there. There were smudges on the glass, long, pale fingers pressing against it, as though someone had been watching me from the other side. I felt a cold wave of dread crash over me, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, but something held me there, something in the back of my mind telling me that this was far from over. The next day, I found that the door to the basement had been left slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before, and I had never left it open. But then, as I was inspecting the house, I found something strange. Behind the shelves in the basement, hidden beneath a pile of old boxes, was a hole in the wall. A hole that wasn't there before. The wall was rough, jagged, as though someone had scraped away the plaster with a crude tool. And inside that hole was a small, twisted figure, wrapped in what looked like dirty rags. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A human-shaped form, curled into a fetal position and covered in grime. The stench was unbearable, a nauseating mix of decay and rot. I stumbled backward, terrified, but as I turned to run, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there, only the darkness of the basement stretching out before me. I sprinted upstairs, slamming the door behind me and locking it, but when I turned to face the living room, I saw him. Mr. Finch was standing in the doorway, his pale eyes fixed on me. His lips curled into a grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "I told you I would see you again," he said, his voice low and ominous. I froze, unable to move, as he stepped forward into the house. His presence was suffocating, and the air around me seemed to grow colder with each step he took. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, whatever had been happening in that basement, was connected to him. The truth was out, but I didn't know if I could survive it. Mr. Finch had been watching me for a reason. I had always been the prey, and now it was too late to escape. I moved into the house on Elmsford Lane just over 6 months ago, fresh out of a toxic relationship and desperate for a new start. And at first, everything seemed perfect. The house was small but cozy, with an old-world charm that felt right for someone looking for peace and solitude. The neighbors, though, were another story. Mr. Hollis lived next door, in a house just as weathered as mine but much larger and more isolated. From the first day, I noticed something strange about him. He never came out during the day. It wasn't just that he kept to himself. It was that he seemed to avoid the sunlight entirely. I would catch glimpses of him through the gaps in his curtains, but he always kept to the shadows, barely visible. I thought it was just odd behavior for an old man, but I didn't pay much mind to it. At least not at first. Started small. The first time I noticed it was when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the walls at night. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, rhythmic, almost as if someone was knocking on the walls from the other side. I told myself it was just the house settling or maybe pipes, but the sound continued every night at the same time, like clockwork. It was always around midnight, a light tapping that would eventually stop just before I could fall asleep. But then things escalated. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard something strange. Voices. It wasn't the usual clamor of street noise or the hum of passing cars. These voices were closer, faint, but unmistakable. They sounded like whispers, and they came from the walls again. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself that I was just hearing things. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, until I could make out actual words. Faint, soft words that sent chills down my spine. "I know you're listening." The whisper echoed through the walls, just on the edge of my hearing. "He knows. He always knows." My heart raced as I stood frozen, eyes wide, trying to understand what was happening. The whispering stopped suddenly, and I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. I thought I was imagining things, but it didn't stop. It continued for the next few nights, the whispers growing louder each time, as if someone on the other side was desperate to be heard. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I decided to visit Mr. Hollis. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The house looked untouched, as if no one had lived there in years, but I knew someone was there. I felt it. The silence around his house was oppressive, like something was holding it in a vice, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to try the back door, which was always unlocked, and that's when I made my first real mistake. The back door creaked as I stepped inside, and the air inside the house was thick with dust. It felt like no one had been in there for a long time, but there were signs of life. Footprints in the dust, dishes on the counter, half-eaten food left out. The house was eerily quiet, but something was off. I walked through the darkened hallways, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. As I passed one room, I heard the faintest whisper. I froze, my blood running cold. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was barely audible, yet it rang in my ears like a warning. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one in sight. I continued to move through the house, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against me. That's when I saw it. On the wall of the living room, a message written in what looked like chalk. It was crude, hastily written, but the words made my blood run cold. "He's watching you." I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder now, coming from every direction. I could hear Mr. Hollis' voice, though it didn't sound quite like him. It was distorted, as if it was being spoken by something else entirely. "You can't leave now." Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent lurking just beyond the shadows. Then I saw him, Mr. Hollis, standing in the doorway, but he wasn't the man I remembered. His eyes were wide, vacant, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. He was a hollow shell of a person, his body shaking as if something inside him was trying to break free. And then I understood he wasn't the one in control. Something was using him, something that had been living in the walls of this house, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared to enter. I backed away, terrified, but the shadows moved with me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to stay, to listen. "He's here, and now he's yours." The voice whispered, louder now, coming from inside my head. I screamed, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was Mr. Hollis' twisted grin. I woke up back in my own house, but the whispers were still there, echoing in my ears. I could hear them even now, all around me, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. Mr. Hollis was gone, but I knew he was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And now I realize I've become part of the house. The whispers have started again, and I can feel them growing closer. There's no escape. The walls have ears, and they're listening. When I first moved into my new house on Elm Street, I was thrilled by the peacefulness of the neighborhood. It was a quaint, quiet area, tucked away from the hustle and bustle, the kind of place I imagined I would find peace after years of living in a busy city. The house next door, however, always seemed different from the others. It was an old Victorian, the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. The windows were large and dark, and the paint had peeled away in places, giving it a haunted look. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. The neighbors, on the other hand, were another story. The house had always been empty, but sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in the windows. Shadows passing by, strange flickers of light late at night. I tried not to think too much about it. The first few months were calm, but then something odd began happening. At night, when I lay in bed, I could hear soft knocks at my door. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the knocks grew more frequent, more insistent, until one night, it woke me from a deep sleep. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, wondering if someone was at my door. I crept quietly to the front of the house and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. The porch light flickered. I opened the door and stepped outside, my eyes scanning the yard, but the street was empty, not a soul in sight. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the knocks continued night after night, always at the same time, around midnight. One evening, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to investigate the house next door. I walked across the yard, heart pounding in my chest, and approached the front door. I rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. The house was quiet, dark. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. There was a small, cracked window on the side of the house, and through it, I saw movement inside. Shadows moving quickly, too quickly. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone in the yard. I turned around and saw, standing in the shadows, a figure, tall, thin, and pale. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, unsure if I was dreaming or if something was truly wrong. I ran back to my house, slamming the door behind me, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The next few days, the knocking grew louder, more frantic. The walls of my house seemed to vibrate with each thump. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. One night, I decided to stay awake, determined to get to the bottom of it. As the clock struck midnight, the knocks started again, louder than ever, echoing through the house. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly crept outside, my hands shaking as I stepped into the yard. I pointed the beam of light towards the neighbor's house, and for the first time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were faces in the windows, dozens of them, all staring at me. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their mouths twisted in silent screams. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't look away. As I backed away from the house, I noticed something even worse. The shadowy figure from before was standing in the doorway now, its pale, featureless face leaning forward as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. In that instant, I felt a coldness in my bones that I couldn't explain. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, like it was pushing me back into my own house, forcing me to retreat. But I couldn't let it win. I took a step forward, determined to confront whatever haunted that house. But before I could get any closer, a voice, low and gravelly, whispered in my ear, "Don't." I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. I turned back to the house, only to see that the figures in the windows had vanished. The knocking stopped. Silence fell over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. But that peace was fleeting. Over the next few days, the knocks stopped, but the house next door seemed to come alive in other ways. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to have an eerie glow to them at night. The walls would creak and groan as though something was shifting inside, moving in a way that didn't make sense. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced over at the house, I could feel it watching me. Every time I looked, the figures were there, standing behind the curtains, staring with eyes that never blinked, never moved. Eventually, I could no longer tell if they were real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The nightmares started soon after, vivid dreams of the figures, of the tall, pale figure standing just outside my window, whispering my name in the darkness. Each night, the dream grew worse, more real, until I woke up to find myself standing in front of the house next door, my hands pressed against the cold window, staring inside, unable to move. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I came to my senses, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. It was happening again, the line between sleep and reality blurring in ways I couldn't understand. And then, one night, as I sat on my couch, I saw the figure standing in my window, just as it had always been in the neighbor's house. Only this time, it wasn't in the window next door. It was in my own. It was standing right outside, watching me, its face still pale, its eyes still glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't going to stop. I don't know how long I've been living here now, but I can't escape the feeling that the figure is still watching, still waiting. I can hear the soft knocking at my door every night, always at midnight, but when I open it, there's never anyone there. I've stopped trying to sleep. The figures in the windows never leave, always staring, always watching, waiting for something, and no matter how hard I try to ignore it, I can't escape the feeling that the house next door is alive with something I can't understand. It's as though I've become part of their world now, and there's no way out. The house next door is always there, always watching, and no matter how far I run, the knocking never stops, and neither do the eyes, always staring from the windows, always waiting for me to join them. The first time I noticed the house next door was when I moved into my new home, late at night, dragging the last of my boxes up to the porch. I hadn't paid much attention to it at first. It looked like just another house, albeit slightly older and more run down than the others on the block, with its darkened windows and peeling paint. But over time, strange things started happening. At night, when I'd sit alone in my living room, I'd get the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me through the windows. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation wouldn't go away. It became a routine for me to check the blinds every night before going to bed, just to reassure myself that no one was there. Though every time I did, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something was wrong. One evening, I decided to walk over and introduce myself to the new neighbors, seeing as I hadn't seen anyone come or go in days, not even a flicker of light from inside. The house looked abandoned, almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. I rang the doorbell and waited, but there was no answer. The silence was suffocating, and after a few minutes, I turned to leave, but then something strange caught my eye, a shadow moving behind one of the upstairs windows. My heart skipped a beat, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I never saw anyone come or go, and the house remained dark, even as the weeks passed. But the unease grew stronger. I started hearing strange noises late at night, soft knocks on the walls, faint footsteps overhead, but no one was ever there. My sleep became disturbed, my nights longer and filled with a tension I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I grabbed a flashlight and walked next door, feeling a strange urge to investigate. As I stepped onto the porch, I could feel the air grow colder, the silence oppressive. I knocked on the door, but this time it wasn't unanswered. The door creaked open slowly, just enough for me to see a glimpse of the inside. The house was covered in dust, and the air smelled musty and old, but it didn't look abandoned. There were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, the faint smell of cooking, but no one was there. Just as I was about to step inside, a figure appeared in the doorway, blocking my way. They were tall and gaunt, their skin pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and they stared at me, unblinking. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't say a word, just stared at me with a cold, unfeeling gaze. Suddenly, the door slammed shut in my face, and I stumbled back, heart racing. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could turn away, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. The figure was standing in one of the windows, staring down at me. I couldn't look away, frozen by its gaze. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and placed it on the window, pressing its palm against the glass, leaving a faint smear of something dark. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that stare, but when I finally turned to leave, the sound of footsteps followed me, steady and unhurried, as if someone were walking just behind me. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, always just out of sight, watching. The house next door remained silent, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. Then, one evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard the unmistakable sound of something tapping on my window. I froze, my blood turning to ice, and slowly, I turned toward the sound. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw a pale figure standing just outside. The figure from the house next door. I didn't know how long it had been there, but I could feel its presence like a cold weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the figure raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, its fingers leaving a dark stain. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. But the stain on the glass remained, dark and creeping, like something alive. The house next door was quiet again after that, but I knew I couldn't stay. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. The figure was real, and it was still there, watching, waiting. I don't know who or what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer safe. The next day, I packed up everything I could and left, unable to shake the feeling that the figure from next door had followed me. I haven't been back to that house since, but sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone in bed, I hear it. Those faint footsteps, the tapping on the window, the sound of something watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that the figure from the house next door is still out there, waiting for me to return, to step back into its grasp. It was late one evening when I first noticed something strange about the house next door, the one that had been empty for years. I'd lived in this quiet neighborhood for months, and not once had I seen anyone go in or out of that place. It was as if it had been abandoned, decaying slowly while the rest of the street remained intact. But that night, I saw a light flicker through the cracked windows, and I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a walk around the block just to see if anyone had moved in. As I approached, I noticed the front door was ajar, the shadows inside thick and heavy like something was waiting. I hesitated for a moment, but then a chill ran through me, and I found myself walking up the creaky steps, my heart racing as I reached for the handle. It was cold, and the wood groaned under my touch. The door swung open with a slow, agonizing squeak, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew and old wood filled my nostrils. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just an empty, suffocating space that seemed to stretch on forever. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just an old house, nothing more. But then, I heard it, a faint scraping sound from the floor above, something dragging slowly, methodically, like the sound of nails on wood. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. A silence so thick it felt suffocating filled the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I slowly began to back out of the house. But before I could reach the door, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and distorted. "You shouldn't have come in." My blood ran cold, and I froze, unable to move or scream. The voice came again, louder this time, almost mocking. "You shouldn't have come in. Now you're mine." Suddenly, the house around me seemed to come alive, the walls stretching, the floor shifting beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, but I couldn't escape. I turned and ran toward the door, my legs shaking with fear, but as I reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I could hear something moving behind me, something big, heavy, dragging itself across the floor. I turned, and that's when I saw it. A figure tall and twisted, its body unnaturally long, its face pale and hollow with eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. The figure moved closer, its legs jerking unnaturally as it dragged itself toward me. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the house itself was swallowing my voice. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, and I collapsed onto the floor, trembling. The figure loomed over me, its lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth sharp and yellow like broken glass. It reached down, its bony fingers brushing against my skin, and I could feel the cold of its touch seeping into my bones. "You're not leaving," it whispered, its voice now a guttural growl. "You never were." As it pulled me closer, I saw the walls around me shift again, the shadows growing darker, closing in, suffocating me. I struggled, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the figure was too strong, its grip tightening around me, dragging me further into the heart of the house. The floor beneath me gave way, and I tumbled down into a dark pit, the walls of the house pressing in from every side, the air thick with the smell of decay. I landed hard, pain shooting through my body, but there was no time to recover. The figure loomed above me, its face twisting in a sickening grin. I could feel its presence all around me, the oppressive weight of something ancient and wrong. I closed my eyes, praying that it was just a nightmare, that I'd wake up in my own bed, safe and sound. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, its eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't have come in," it repeated, its voice now a chant, echoing in the walls. "Now you're mine." The floor beneath me shifted again, and I screamed, but the sound was lost in the dark, the house swallowing me whole. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I'll ever leave. The whispers still echo in the walls, and I can hear the figure moving in the shadows, waiting. Sometimes, I wonder if I ever really left my house at all. Sometimes, I think the house next door was never empty at all, just waiting for someone to wander too close, to listen to the whispers, to fall into the trap. And now, I'm just another part of the house, another lost soul trapped within its walls, forever to be consumed by the darkness that lives there. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new chapter in my life after a brutal breakup that left me emotionally drained and exhausted. So when I found the perfect little house on a quiet street with a for sale sign out front, I thought I'd stumbled upon a peaceful escape. The house next to mine was old, weathered but charming in its own way, until I noticed the man living there. At first, I thought nothing of it. I was too caught up in my own turmoil to care about who lived next door, but it didn't take long for me to notice him. Every time I went outside to get the mail or water the plants, there he was, standing in his window watching me. His eyes were always fixed on me, cold, unblinking, like a predator tracking its prey. I could feel his gaze burning into me even though I'd never seen him move. I thought I was just being paranoid, but the more I saw him, the more I felt like I was being watched every second of the day. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just an old man, maybe he was lonely, maybe he was just curious about the new neighbor. But it didn't take long for my unease to grow into something darker. The first thing that happened was when I was sitting in my living room late one night watching TV. My front door was locked, the windows shut tight, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the unmistakable sound of scraping against my window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the window, and there he was, the man from next door standing just outside, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. I recoiled, heart racing, but before I could even think to run or scream, he was gone, as if he had never been there. I thought I was imagining things, or maybe I was just tired, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for the sound to return. Didn't. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't. As the days went by, strange things began happening around the house. My kitchen drawers would be open when I was sure I had closed them. Things would be out of place, and there was always this feeling of being watched. I checked the locks on the doors and windows every night, but they were always secure. I even went to the police once, explaining how the man was standing outside my window watching me. They told me there was nothing they could do unless he actually broke into the house. I was left feeling helpless, like I was just waiting for something worse to happen. And then it did. One night, after an exhausting day at work, I came home to find my front door wide open. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stepped inside, scanning the darkened hallway. The house was eerily silent. Everything appeared to be in its place, but the door was ajar, and there was a strange feeling in the air, like something was off. I checked every room, every closet, every corner, but there was no sign of forced entry or anyone inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw the text. It was from an unknown number. "I see you." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I quickly blocked the number, but my hands were shaking. The house felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight, but I managed to make myself some tea and sat on the couch, trying to calm down. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from the other side of my living room. Slow, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that told me someone was there. Someone was watching me from the dark. I jumped up and ran to the door, slamming it shut behind me, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave me. I ran to my neighbor's house, knocking frantically on his door, hoping he would answer. He never did. The house next door was always so quiet, always so still, but tonight, the lights were off and the windows were covered with heavy curtains. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Desperate, I walked around to the back of the house, hoping to see something, anything, that might explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. The back door slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it as impenetrable as the night itself. I don't know what possessed me to open it, but I did, slipping inside quietly. The air was damp, cold, and stale. I crept through the house, my breath shallow, my heart racing. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. I reached the living room where I froze. There, on the floor, were several pictures of me taken from inside my house. There were photos of me sitting on my couch, walking to my car, watering my plants. It was as if he had been watching me for months, cataloging every moment of my life. Panic surged through me, and I turned to leave, but the front door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The darkness around me felt suffocating, and I could feel his presence in every corner of the house. I heard his voice, soft, almost whispering, but it was clear as day. "You're mine now." The door behind me creaked open, and I turned to see him standing there, his eyes wide and gleaming with something I can't even describe. He stepped forward, his grin stretched unnaturally wide, his fingers twitching as if he was reaching for me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to escape. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was his voice, laughing, echoing in my ears. I've been waiting for this moment. When I woke up, I was back in my own house. Everything was as it should be, except the pictures. They were everywhere, on the walls, on the tables, in the kitchen. Photos of me. There was no sign of the man, no sign of anything strange. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still waiting. I've since moved, but I know he's still out there. I can feel his eyes on me every time I look out the window, every time I step outside. The man from next door is still out there, and he's never stopped watching.